Hey guys, tonight we step into a frozen hush, a Russian winter so still it sounds like it's listening. The snow outside the wooden izba glows blue in the moonlight. Inside, firewood cracks, a kettle hisses, and then a knock. Not loud, just once, but enough to stop every breath in the room. Grandmother sets her spindle down. The baby stirs. The oldest daughter, pale-faced and tight-lipped, rises to open the door. No one is there, just a tuft of black feathers and a twisted scrap of birch bark tucked into the frame. Grandmother goes whiter than the frost. She doesn't need to read it. She knows what it says. Somewhere in the woods, someone is watching, waiting, and the church would tell you it's not the devil. It's worse. It's her. If this kind of sleepy storytelling is your thing, hit like and subscribe. It's free and you can always unsubscribe if you change your mind. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and how you're doing tonight. Now, settle in, breathe slow, and let's walk into the dark. You trudge through the first layer of fresh snow, your boots making soft compressions as you follow the smoke trails curling from chimneys. A northern village in 1653, smells of pine resin and rye bread, and fear. Not the flashy kind, not pitchforks and torches, the kind that sips from silence. It's the era of whispered prayers and stolen glances. Something's wrong with the neighbor's cow. Maybe it's just the cold. A child dies in the night. Maybe it's just fate. But say the wrong thing and you'll hear it. She's keeping a black book. Not a Bible, not a diary. A tattered, oily thing, passed down from a great-grandmother who, conveniently, no one remembers dying. Inside, recipes, sort of, for healing, for cursing, for making the boy down the lane dream only of you, for speaking with his spirit through 3 knots tied in horsehair. These books weren't always real, but people believed in them, which was more dangerous, because if a woman helped your sick son recover with a handful of birch bark and a blessing whispered backward, maybe she had a book like that, and if she didn't, maybe she'd better find one fast or burn. There's an old Russian saying, "A curse does not fall from the sky, someone pulls the string." And for the Orthodox Church, witches weren't just string pullers. They were wire cutters, unruly, unbaptized, unlicensed by God. That's the thing that scared them, not that witches were evil, but that they were free. They lived outside the parish's reach, outside the czar's census. They answered to no bishop, their prayers bent in odd directions, and their punishments? Well, those weren't always handed out in daylight. You step through a crooked wooden gate. Beneath a frost-covered cross, a bundle of dried nettle hangs like a warning. Inside this home, the matriarch is the doctor, the midwife, the counselor, and, if you believe the whispers, the one who put a curse on the miller when he refused to pay her. But ask the local priest and he'll squirm. He can't prove anything. She comes to church on feast days. She crosses herself, but he's seen things. That fox that sits outside her door every dusk. Her habit of speaking to trees, her herbs don't smell like any he's ever seen. Here's your mainstream history fact. In 17th century Muscovite, the church formally codified volkvi, sorcerers, or heretics of the old ways, as not just sinners, but enemies of the state. Not because they were in league with Satan, but because they represented an alternative source of authority. These were not just crones with brooms. They were often the only people in a village who knew how to deliver a baby, mend a bone, or interpret a strange dream. Power, but without a cassock. And the fringe tidbit? There are accounts, hidden in the margins of confession records, of priests themselves quietly visiting these women, not in public, not in daylight, but at night, when their child had a fever, no prayer could break. They'd knock, leave silver, and say nothing the next morning. Historians still argue whether Russia's witch hunts were ever centrally organized like in Western Europe. Unlike the grand burning spectacles of Germany or France, Russian witch accusations were local, intimate, murky, no bonfires in Red Square, just a whispered word in the wrong ear, a quiet visit from a church investigator, a girl who vanished after confessing she dreamed of walking backwards into the river on Ivan Kupala night. And then there's the birch broom. Ordinary to you, maybe, but to a villager, sacred, cleansing, the tool of the bathhouse and the banishment. Witches were said to sweep away illness, or souls. A birch broom tied with red thread, found above a doorway, could mean protection or a curse. Depends who left it, depends who finds it. You pass a barn where a window's been blacked out with soot, a sign of mourning or hiding, it's hard to tell. A dog growls low from beneath the porch, and a rooster crows too late, too strange. You feel watched, not in fear, but in curiosity, as though something old and clever is wondering what kind of visitor you are. The knock that started all this, maybe it wasn't a warning, maybe it was a welcome. Because in this first breath of our long night, you're starting to feel it. The edge between fear and reverence, magic and medicine, devilry and grandmotherly wisdom is thinner than frost on glass. The church wanted the devil to be a monster, but these women, these witches, they were people, and that's what terrified them most. You walk on, the village fading behind you, boots crunching as the trees close in. The path narrows, pines huddle close like gossiping old men, the air thick with the hush of deep forest. And now you're not just in the woods, you're in before pews, before sermons, before men in black robes, pointed fingers. This is Rus, not Russia, and the church hasn't come yet, not fully. The air still hums with something older, something tangled with roots, blood, and rain. It's easy to forget when flipping through clean pages of history books that once upon a time, most of Eastern Europe wasn't Christian. The Slavic tribes of ancient Rus worshipped forests, rivers, and fire. They built idols out of stone and wood, tall, silent gods with hollow eyes and no mouths. They didn't need mouths. The wind spoke for them. And the ones who listened best weren't men in fur hats or warrior chiefs. They were women, grandmothers, widows, girls who wandered a little too far from the path and came back different. You duck beneath a crooked limb and step into a clearing. There's something ancient here. You can feel it. A ring of stones, mossy and patient. A stump with coins pressed into its cracks. A chicken feather. Someone's been here, recently. You see, in the old times, before crosses replaced tree stumps on hilltops, a woman might be the spiritual center of a village. She didn't wear vestments, she didn't read Greek, but she knew which mushrooms talked back, which rivers demanded gifts, which dreams meant birth, and which meant death. She was the healer, the keeper of taboos, the one you turned to when the moon rose blood orange and your cow wouldn't stop screaming. Mainstream fact, the primary chronicle, that's one of our earliest records of Kievan Rus, describes a kingdom teetering between paganism and Christianity. Vladimir the Great tried to force baptism across the land in 988 AD, tossing idols into rivers and tearing down sacred groves. But conversion was shallow. The roots of the old beliefs were stubborn. They clung to everyday life, especially in the hands of women. Christianity might reign in the city cathedrals, but out here in the fields and forests, the old gods whispered. Fringe tidbit, archaeologists found a burial near Novgorod. A woman laid with copper coils in her hair, mushrooms in her pouch, and a comb carved with the symbol of Mokosh, the Slavic goddess of fertility and fate. She was buried during the early Christian period, which means either she resisted the new faith, or someone buried her that way in secret, because they still believed she held power, even in death. You pause near a felled tree. Carved into its bark are spirals, crosses, and, oddly, what looks like a foot, just one. Big toe, chipped. This was common. The Perunov znak, or sign of Perun, the thunder god, often shared space with little personal marks. Old faith wasn't separate from daily life. It was daily life. And the church didn't like that. When missionaries arrived, they came not just with holy water, but with suspicion. Why were so many women entrusted with power? Why did so many rituals involve bread, milk, herbs, and fire? Things considered feminine, domestic, and therefore suspicious? Historians still argue whether early Christian authorities truly believed the pagan women they met were witches in the later European sense. Some say the term witch only emerged as Christianity consolidated power, a way to root out lingering pockets of spiritual independence. Others argue that the category always existed, that female spiritual authority was seen as dangerous from the moment male priesthoods became dominant. You trudge further, the snow now untouched. Up ahead, a little stream slices through the forest, steam curling like breath. This is where they came to wash charms, to pour milk for domovoi, the house spirits, to whisper names into the water and watch which way the ripples ran. These rituals weren't malicious, not by default. They weren't about harming. They were about balance, appeasement, connection. If a neighbor's child fell ill after you forgot to return her ladle, it wasn't witchcraft. It was justice, or maybe just coincidence. But are you willing to risk it? In this world, power didn't need to be big. It didn't need to be loud. It was quiet and domestic and terrifyingly close. It sat in the corner of the kitchen, in the folds of a skirt, in the whisper of lullabies sung a little too softly on a night with no moon. And that's the heart of it. The pre-Christian world didn't divide the sacred from the everyday. It didn't quarantine holiness into buildings. It wasn't afraid of nature. It was in dialogue with it. That dialogue was messy, deeply feminine, and not always nice, which meant when the church arrived with its clean lines and liturgies, the forest laughed. You reach a grove. There's a shallow pit, ashes cooled but recent. Someone burned something here. You pick through the flakes of char, bones maybe, chicken, some blackened cloth, a braid. The sound of wings overhead, just a raven probably, or not. Here's a little story for you. In the Perm region, local folklore says a woman once walked into the forest during a famine. She begged the trees for food. She came back with 3 loaves of bread, warm, steaming. No one asked where they came from. They ate. They survived. And from that day, the village called her the forest's wife. When the priest tried to excommunicate her, he lost all his teeth. Coincidence? Absolutely, definitely, probably. And that's the trouble. In a world this alive, where shadows move and trees remember, everything could be coincidence, or magic, or both. So you pray, and you hedge your bets, and you leave just enough honey by the hearth that the domovoi doesn't pinch your child's nose shut at night. And you don't cross the women who know which mushrooms talk back. The trees begin to thin now, just slightly. You hear the distant clatter of a wooden pail on stone, a soft voice humming something wordless, half lullaby, half warning. You don't see her yet, but she's there, waiting, watching. You've entered the territory of the one you thought was only a bedtime story, Baba Yaga. But tonight, we're not tucking her into a fairy tale. We're dragging her out of it. You step into the clearing. The ground is churned with hoof prints, claw marks, and the faint outline of something that walked on chicken legs. Or maybe just your imagination. The air smells like ashes, mushrooms, and boiling beetroot. A hut sits ahead, sagging like a tired beast. It's not standing on chicken legs today. That part comes later, or earlier, or maybe not at all. Stories fold like dough in this place. Let's get something clear. Baba Yaga is not a villain. Not exactly, not always. In some stories, she eats children. In others, she helps them. Sometimes she flies in a mortar and pestle. Sometimes she turns into a bird. She's the old woman who lives in the woods, and if that sounds familiar, that's because there were thousands of her, real women, scattered across the forests and villages of Old Rus. Baba Yaga isn't just a folktale, she's an echo of them. Mainstream historical fact. Scholars believe Baba Yaga is a folkloric residue of pre-Christian Slavic priestesses or wise women. The ambiguity of her character, nurturing in one tale, monstrous in the next, reflects the way pagan women were viewed after Christianization, once revered, now reviled. She's not one person, she's a role, a function, the keeper of thresholds, the test, the storm you pass through to grow. But here's your fringe tidbit. In some oral traditions collected as late as the 19th century, Baba Yaga was described as wearing a necklace of keys, dozens of them. Each one opened a box, and each box held a part of the world's memory. People believed her to be the last living soul who remembered what the earth was like before men made maps. Think about that next time you picture her gnawing on a shin bone. Historians still argue whether Baba Yaga was born purely out of myth, or if she evolved from actual women who lived at the edge of towns, served as midwives and herbalists, and frightened people with their blunt wisdom and inconvenient survival. Some argue she's the Christian reinterpretation of death itself, smudged with fear. Others think she's older than death, that she teaches it. You kneel by the hut, no door, not one you can see anyway, but you do see bundles of herbs hanging from the eaves, yarrow, juniper, wormwood, potent stuff, protective or offensive. Again, it depends who you ask. And that's the theme, isn't it? Witches were always two things at once. Baba Yaga could be the monster in the woods or the only one who knew how to find your lost brother. The same hands that crushed bones could cradle a feverish child until the illness broke. The same breath that cursed the Tsar's men could sing your harvest into ripeness. In real-life villages, stories of Baba Yaga often overlapped with local women who lived alone. Maybe they were widows, maybe they never married, maybe they talked to trees. The story served as both warning and protection. Don't go into the woods alone. Don't disrespect the old woman who gives you apples. And for the love of all that's holy, if a house turns around to face you, bow. These tales carried laws older than written ones, rules that kept children safe and adults respectful. But they also preserved power, quiet, female, domestic power, power that lived outside the monastery. The church didn't like that. They tried to replace Baba Yaga with saints. They tried to scrub her out with ink and incense, but still she squatted in the forest of memory, stirring her cauldron, grinning with iron teeth. Speaking of teeth, let's talk about those. In many versions, Baba Yaga has a mouthful of iron. That detail isn't random. In old Russian superstition, iron was a ward against spirits. But here, the witch is the spirit. She's armored with iron from the inside out. You can't exorcise what is the exorcist. You peer into a hollow tree beside the hut. Inside, you find bones arranged in a circle, a lock of hair, and a little doll made of sticks and twine. Is it a curse, a prayer, a memory? Maybe all three, maybe none, but you don't touch it. You know better. Another story. In the Arkhangelsk region, a woman named Yevdokia was said to live like Baba Yaga. She never cut her hair. She talked to owls, and she could predict snow by how potatoes grew. When she died, no priest would bury her, so the villagers buried her themselves in the woods facing east. Every winter after, her grave bloomed mushrooms. In winter, people left bread there, just in case. These are not fairy tales, they're folk memory, half history, half survival instinct. The church feared witches because they remembered a time before fear, a time when power came from listening to the land, not from reading Latin in stone buildings. And Baba Yaga? She's not gone, she's just waiting. In a joke your babushka told that ended a little too abruptly, in the scent of burning juniper on a foggy morning. In the broom your mother leans behind the door, bristles up, always up. Because that's another rule. You never leave a broom bristle side down. You don't want to brush away the good spirits. Even now you hesitate before saying, that's just superstition. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and maybe the door to Baba Yaga's hut doesn't open unless you already believe it's there. You walk further, the path changing beneath your feet, pine needles to pack dirt to something squishier, darker. The air thickens. You're not in the forest anymore, not exactly. You're in someone's memory of it. The smells come first, dried rosemary, garlic, something sweet and spoiled, like bruised apples left too long in a cellar. Then the tools appear. Not magical, not at first glance. A mortar and pestle, a bundle of dried sage tied with red thread, an old wooden spoon with symbols carved so deeply the bowl is worn almost flat. This is where the real witches lived, not the storybook hags, the women who kept your village from unraveling when no priest would come, when the snow buried the roads, when the baby wouldn't cry or wouldn't stop, the midwives, the charmers, the herbalists, the ones who could say a word into a basin of water and suddenly the fever broke, or didn't. You step into the shadow of a wooden hut, low and leaning, no glowing runes, no screeching familiars, just a cold hearth, a woven doll, and a wall of dried plants hanging like upside-down saints, wormwood for banishing spirits, mint for calming the gut, rowan for protection, and one jar, unlabeled, filled with something green and viscous. You don't ask. In early Russian villages, these women were vital. If you lived 2 days' ride from the nearest monastery, who else would you trust with your wounds? Your crops? Your sanity? They knew the properties of dozens of herbs, not just which healed, but which hurt. That gave them power, and power outside the church? That was dangerous. Here's your mainstream historical fact. For centuries in Russia, midwives and herbal healers were often the most educated women in a community. Not formally, but practically. They knew anatomy from experience, medicine from trial and error, and local lore by heart. Their status was respected and feared, especially because their success couldn't be explained by scripture. Fringe tidbit? In some regions, particularly among the Finno-Ugric peoples of the north, these women were believed to literally change shape when gathering herbs, to become foxes or owls for a single night each month. This wasn't just metaphor. Some families passed down talismans wrapped in fur or feathers, said to protect descendants from inheriting the shift. Historians still argue whether this healing role was once officially sanctioned, tolerated, or simply ignored until it became threatening. Some Orthodox records describe female healers with a kind of grudging respect, while others condemn them outright as demonic deceivers. The line moved depending on the century and the plague count. You spot a cradle tucked under a table. It's not being used now, but the blanket inside is embroidered with protective knots. 8 pointed stars, eyes, tiny X's, one for each godmother who visited after the child was born. One to guard the head, one to guard the soul, and one for, well, something else. It was common in rural Russia for women to whisper charms over newborns. Not prayers, charms. The difference? The church didn't write them. They were passed down like lullabies sung in the back of the throat while the neighbors weren't listening. The line between comfort and spell was razor thin. There's a joke in the village. If you want to know who the witch is, wait for winter. See whose house still smells like time. You chuckle, but you glance behind you anyway. There's a chill now, and the woods feel just a little too quiet. These witches, these women, often had no formal titles, no covens, no pointed hats, but they kept bundles of nettles near the door and crushed eggshells before throwing them out, lest someone use them to bind their luck. They spit over their shoulders after sneezing. They never spoke the devil's name aloud, not out of fear, but because names are sticky. Once something knows you've named it, it might follow you home. Another story. In 1664, a woman named Agrafena was accused of placing a charm under a man's doorstep. He said it made him impotent. She said it was just lavender and dried clover for luck. The judge didn't believe her, but the priest who testified against her had 2 miscarriages in his household that year. People said it was unrelated. Probably. Maybe. You glance at the shelves, little bottles labeled with symbols, not words, one sealed with wax, another stoppered with cloth and tied with human hair. The witch doesn't call it magic. She calls it knowing. Knowing when to boil the root and when to burn it. Knowing when a dream means illness and when it means it's time to bury the bread knife again. That's the thing. These weren't spells in the Hollywood sense. They were layers of meaning. Actions repeated so often they carved a groove in the soul. Cross yourself. Blow on the wound. Whisper to the smoke. You don't have to believe, just don't interrupt. The church feared these rituals not because they failed, but because they worked. People believed in them more than sermons. Why kneel on cold stone and wait for salvation when you could hand the local herbalist a pie and be cured by evening? You bend to inspect the floor. Scratched into the dirt are concentric circles, a symbol of protection or containment. Depends what's inside. You count the rings. 7, that's significant. 7 was a sacred number in pre-Christian Rus. Days, colors, spirits, sins. And the women who kept the old calendar alive were the ones who got watch, carefully. The church began to formalize its distrust. Priests started instructing villagers to report any woman who offered healing without holy water. Any woman who seemed to know when a traveler would arrive before he appeared. Any woman who kept a mirror near the window, a known conduit for night whisperers, of course. But these warnings didn't stop people from visiting. They just made them sneakier. Offer a coin and a sausage. Don't speak her name after dark. Leave the herb bundle on the doorstep. Don't thank her. Never thank her. Just leave. Quietly. And that's how they endured. These women weren't out to dominate the world. They weren't dancing naked under eclipses. except maybe once in 1428, and it was a particularly moody moon. No, they were mothers, widows, healers, survivors. They didn't want power, they wanted autonomy, and that, as always, was the real crime. You step out of the hut, the door creaking softly behind you. The woods feel warmer now, as if they've accepted your presence. Or maybe they're just amused. The witches are still watching. Not from cauldrons or clouds, but from recipe books with cracked spines, from the scent of basil on a summer breeze, from the places your grandmother never let you go barefoot. They're not gone. They're just waiting for you to remember. The trees behind you shift again, not with wind, but with memory. You're deeper now, not just into the forest, but into the roots of something older than rules. Ahead, the path bends, not sharply, but like it's considering where you're going. The trees part around a clearing, and there it is, a ring of standing stones. Nothing grand, nothing Stonehenge-y, just squat boulders, lichen-covered and half-swallowed by moss. But they hum. You feel it in your molars. A deep, patient frequency, like an old woman muttering under her breath while stirring something thick and bubbling. This is the part the church never really conquered. The forest, the memory of the forest. You're walking through the folklore that refused to die, the rites done in silence, the ones that needed no permission, the old beliefs. There's no single book for them, no scrolls or catechisms, just practices, whispered things, the placement of shoes, the timing of a harvest, the way a pot is stirred, clockwise for healing, counterclockwise for revenge, that kind of thing. Even after Christianity became the official faith of Russ, the forest stayed weird. Out here, you might still find an offering tree, a birch wrapped in red cloth with coins jammed into its bark and milk splashed at its roots. Technically, that's heresy. Practically, it's tradition. And if you're going to offend someone, better it be the bishop than the spirit who controls whether your cow survives the winter. Mainstream historical fact: in post-Christian Rus, especially from the 11th to 17th centuries, the Orthodox Church struggled to eradicate dual faith, a phenomenon where villagers practiced Christianity and pagan rites simultaneously. People would attend church on Sunday, then offer bread to the river spirit on Monday, just in case. You never know which god is actually listening. You move past the stones, your boots brushing against sprigs of wormwood. It's bitter in the air, the kind of plant that's both a remedy and a warning. You don't say anything. Something about this place hushes your voice. A raven hops along a branch above, cocking its head like it recognizes you, or at least remembers your scent. Fringe tidbit. In some parts of rural Siberia, it was said that if you found a hollow tree and whispered a secret into it, the forest would keep it safe, but it would own it from then on. And if someone else found that same tree and leaned their ear against it, well, let's just say some old feuds started that way. Historians still argue whether the persistence of these forest rituals was conscious rebellion or cultural inertia. Were people deliberately resisting the church? Or did they simply never stop believing in the older patterns because they still worked? Bread still rose. Babies were still born healthy. The frost still came. Why change what wasn't broken? You kneel by one of the stones. There's a patch of soot beside it. Someone lit a fire here recently. Probably not teenagers being edgy. This isn't that kind of forest. No, this was deliberate. You can see the way the coals were ringed with pine cones, a charm for vision, or clarity, or maybe just tradition. Nearby, a tree has symbols carved into its trunk, a spiral, a cross, a fish, but not the Christian kind. This one's older, cruder. Maybe a charm for luck, maybe a map, maybe both. Symbols did double duty out here, like the women who used them. These witches, these forest women, didn't just dabble in ritual, they preserved it, passed it down like recipes. Add 2 pinches of salt, turn 3 times widdershins, and don't look at the door while it's closing. That kind of thing. And if it sounds silly, well, try breaking the rules and see what happens. A chicken lays backward eggs, a child sleepwalks into the river, or maybe nothing. But are you sure? You stop beside a shallow pool. The water is dark, still, mirror-like. In old Rus, this would have been a scrying pool, a place where women came to see who they'd marry, or when they'd die, or what the next harvest would bring. They'd float candles in nutshells and read the flicker of flame like a sentence. The church called it vanity. The women called it preparation. Even now, you're tempted to stare. You don't. You remember the rule. Never ask the water a question you aren't ready to hear answered. Here's a story. In the forests near Yaroslavl, a young girl named Daria disappeared on the night of Ivan Kupala, a summer festival with deep pagan roots. She was found a day later, dry-eyed, barefoot, and smiling. She wouldn't speak, ever again. But years later, people said she'd learned to predict storms by listening to the moss, that she could walk barefoot on snow and never leave a print. She never married, but 3 children were named after her. All lived to old age. These stories weren't recorded. They weren't judged in court or printed in books, but they endured, passed down from mother to daughter, usually while slicing onions or combing hair. You didn't need parchment when you had memory and gossip. And here's the part the church didn't understand. It wasn't that people didn't believe in Christ. They did. They lit candles, they sang hymns, they crossed themselves before dinner. But they also buried scissors under the threshold. They also tied red thread around a child's wrist. Because belief isn't a line, it's a web. You brush your hand across the bark of a pine, rough and sticky with sap. There's a charm tucked in the crook, a small cloth bundle tied shut with catgut. Inside might be herbs, hair, teeth. You don't open it, you don't need to, you know what it means. The church feared witches not because they were evil, but because they were resilient. You can outlaw a book, you can burn a temple. But how do you outlaw knowing? How do you excommunicate a habit? How do you make a village forget the way its grandmother stood by the fire, muttering to the soup, stirring it in a pattern only she understood? You walk on, the forest beginning to loosen its grip. Ahead, a path, not well trod, but visible, and on a nearby tree, a scrap of linen tied in a knot. For luck, for love, for memory, or maybe just because someone's grandmother said it should be there. You step past it, careful not to touch. The path leads you back toward the edge of a village, not quite the same one you left earlier. This one feels different, tighter, as if its wooden fences are meant not to keep things out, but to keep secrets in. Chickens cluck without rhythm. A cat watches you from under a porch, unmoving, as if calculating something far more ancient than curiosity. Then you hear it, a child scream, then silence, then weeping. You move toward the sound, your footsteps slow, respectful. Ahead, a small group huddles in a yard, a mother on her knees, face pale with panic, a boy limp in her arms. Beside them, the priest mumbling a prayer over the child's head. His cross swings gently. He looks unsure, as if he's done this before, and failed before too. And then she arrives. No one called her, at least not with words. But she knew. She always knows. A woman in a long coat stitched with patches. Her boots are mismatched. Her hair is mostly gray, but her eyes are sharp as black ice. She doesn't look like salvation. She looks like interruption, like defiance wrapped in wool. The priest steps back, not far, just enough to show his disapproval without risking blame if she succeeds. She kneels by the child. No prayer, no cross, just a slow gesture, a hand hovering over the boy's chest, then brushing the crown of his head. She mutters something under her breath. The villagers don't lean closer. They already know. You don't listen to the words. You respect them by staying outside the circle of breath. Then she pulls a small blade from her coat. It's not sharp. It's old, carved bone handle. The kind of thing passed down with a warning, not a receipt. She slides it under the boy's tongue, just barely, not enough to draw blood, just enough to touch something. Then she lifts a spoon of cold water and lets it dribble down his chin. Another muttered phrase. And then, a cough, wet, weak, but real. The boy starts to cry. The priest tightens his lips. The mother starts sobbing. The woman stands, tucks the blade away, and without a word, turns to leave. You just witnessed something that happened in hundreds of Russian villages. A quiet power struggle that had nothing to do with devils or angels. The church's power versus the witch's knife. And in that moment, the knife won. Mainstream historical fact: in many rural Russian communities from the 16th through 19th centuries, Local women healers were the only reliable medical aid. Orthodox clergy were often educated in theology, not medicine. When prayers didn't work, people turned, secretly, quietly, to the ones who knew how to work with herbs, smoke, salt, and touch. Church officials tolerated this until they didn't. Fringe tidbit: in certain regions, especially near the Urals, some village healers were known to keep serpent knives, curved blades passed down only to daughters or apprentices. Legend said they were blessed by the spirit of Zmai Goranik, the Slavic dragon. Whether that was metaphor or not, many of these knives were buried with their owners, and when found centuries later, still wrapped in linen soaked with juniper oil. Historians still argue whether these midwife healers were accused witches only when things went wrong, or whether their power was always seen as criminal. Some believe the church made uneasy peace with their presence, so long as they stayed invisible. Others claim records were destroyed to hide just how often priests failed, and women like this stepped in. You walk past the house now. The mother is kissing her child's forehead. The priest has retreated, staring into the distance as if trying to decide whether what just happened was divine mercy or something else. Another tale. In 1708, in a village near Pskov, a woman named Uliana was accused of using the unclean knife. She had saved 3 infants in a single month after prayers failed, but after a 4th child died, the priest called for an inquiry. Her knife was confiscated. It was said to hum at night. No one knows where it went after the trial. But years later, another childless woman in a neighboring village claimed she found a blade buried in her hearth and conceived the next spring. Coincidence? You pass a goat pen now and someone has hung a braid of garlic over the gate. Nothing strange there, but also a strip of embroidered cloth, red thread, protective runes, a pagan charm, hidden in plain sight. No one's fooling anyone, but no one's admitting it either. The icon and the knife coexisted like this for centuries. The church offered heaven, the healer offered results. One prayed for rain, the other whispered to clouds. And when you're desperate, when your child won't breathe, your cow won't give milk, your mind is unraveling. You don't care if the hand helping you wears a cross or smells like burning sage. You pause at a well. Something's been tied to the handle, a little doll made of twine and wool, soaked in something that smells faintly like milk and juniper, a protection charm, or a decoy. Sometimes witches place them near water sources to draw away sickness, trick spirits into attaching to that body instead of yours. The church preached holy water. These women worked with living water, unblessed, unbottled, and much older, the kind that remembers what walked across it centuries ago. Here's the paradox. The church called these women unclean, but they were the ones who cleaned up the mess. Not just physically, spiritually. They absorbed grief, took it into their bones, spat it back out as song or breath or prayer. Not the right prayer, according to doctrine, but one that worked. You reach the edge of the village. The woods begin again. A woman is lighting a candle near a tree stump, murmuring to herself. She doesn't look at you, but she leaves an egg on the stump. That's for someone. Something. No priest will ask where it went. And if you do, if you dare ask what happened to the boy who almost didn't make it, the villagers will shrug. He got better, they'll say. No one will mention the knife, or the water, or the woman with her hair tied in red wool and her blade smelling faintly of chamomile. But they'll remember. So will the forest. You move into a new stretch of countryside, more open now, where the wind sweeps low across the fields and the churches rise a little prouder on the hills. Golden domes shimmer through the haze like polished halos. But closer to the ground, in the shadows beneath barns and behind ovens, the same whispered fears take root. You've reached the age of czars and tribunals, of scribes and official records, of Moscow trying desperately to look Western while still fearing the dark. It's the 17th century, and the church has teeth now. Bureaucracy, doctrine, and increasingly, witch trials. Not because people started believing in witches more, but because powerful men realized how useful it was to accuse them. You pass a group of women in headscarves standing by a fence. Their conversation halts when you approach. One pretends to fix her shawl. Another looks down. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of what it means to be seen talking too much. Because that, as it turns out, was one of the most common warning signs. Not spells, not black cats, not bubbling cauldrons, just too many women talking. In Muscovite, power didn't always come from wealth. It came from knowledge. How to birth a baby, tend a wound, quiet a fevered mind. Women who held that knowledge were respected until they weren't, until they became too confident, too influential, too visible. That's when the accusations began. Mainstream historical fact: under Tsar Alexis in the mid-1600s, Russia experienced a surge of formalized witch trials, often spurred by famine, disease, or political tension. These weren't random villagers panicking. These were state-sanctioned investigations, sometimes even involving boyars and royal advisors. Witches became convenient scapegoats when things went wrong, especially when those things couldn't be blamed on foreigners or heretics. Fringe tidbit: one known witch trial transcript from 1657 includes a man accusing a village woman of making his wife louder than before. Not physically louder, just more opinionated, more critical. He said she talked through his dreams. The court called it a demonic disturbance. She called it having ears. Historians still argue whether Russia's witch trials were driven by religious zeal or political control. Unlike Western Europe, where Satan was the star of every show, Russian records often focus more on social disruption. A woman who disrupted the order, who questioned, corrected, or simply refused to be ignored, was dangerous, even if her only spell was speaking the truth. You pass by a church with an onion dome blackened by time. Its bell doesn't ring anymore. There's an old list nailed to the side, faded by rain. Names, maybe donors, maybe the accused. You don't linger. Because this was also the age when community protection began to shift into community surveillance. Witches weren't discovered through magic circles or howling winds. They were exposed through gossip, jealousy, and confessions under duress. You see, the church and state weren't always so picky about how they got their information. A neighbor accuses you of using salt the wrong way? Suspicious. A priest has a bad dream after you serve him tea? Definitely suspicious. Your goat dies and your rival's goat thrives. Get ready for a knock on the door. One infamous case. In 1674, a midwife named Praskovia from the Vladimir region was accused of causing the miscarriage of a boyar's wife. She had served the family for years, but when the nobleman's firstborn son died of fever and the second never drew breath, the midwife was called to account. No one could explain what went wrong, so the explanation became her. She was interrogated for 3 days. Records show she confessed to asking the wind for favor and binding threads while praying backward. She also confessed to feeding porridge to a rooster on the wrong day of the week. How dare she? She was drowned quietly, not a public spectacle. Her cottage was burned, and later that year, the nobleman's third child survived, which of course proved the witch's guilt. You reach the edge of a village square. There's a raised wooden platform, not gallows, too public for that, just a platform for witnessing, where the accused would stand while the community debated her fate. Imagine it: cold air, wooden planks under your feet, the faces of people you've helped, fed, healed, now squinting at you like they're squinting into the sun. And the worst part? There was no real defense. Because how do you prove you didn't tie a red string around a chicken's neck and whisper to it under the moon? The burden of proof wasn't yours. It wasn't anyone's. Truth didn't matter. Order did. And order was fragile. That's why the state clamped down on these women. Not because they were hurting anyone, but because they represented a rival system of knowing. One that wasn't written in Cyrillic or sealed with wax. One that couldn't be taxed, recorded, or predicted. Another story. In the early 18th century, a czar's advisor quietly consulted a village woman known for her storm bones. She was said to predict uprisings by how her knees ached. When she warned of unrest in the south, he dismissed it, and then watched as a minor Cossack revolt boiled over 2 weeks later. Her house was burned that spring, no official reason given, just unrest. And what about the women who weren't burned, who weren't drowned? They were still marked, whispered about, avoided, or sometimes used unofficially, when the priest didn't know what to do and the cows were dying and the boy wouldn't wake. A coin slipped into a palm, a nod, a warning not to tell. It's easy to romanticize witches, to imagine them as rebels in black cloaks and perfect eyeliner. But the truth? Most of them were women in patched skirts with cracked hands and tired eyes. Women who had knowledge that couldn't be purchased. Women who had seen too many children die to waste time pretending not to know better. The state feared witches not because they summoned storms, but because they summoned trust. Quiet, loyal, stubborn trust that refused to be stamped out by sermons or scrolls. A trust that survived in herbs and lullabies and the way a woman touches your forehead when you're burning up. You glance back at the church as you leave the village. The bells don't ring, but somewhere in a cottage, a pot is simmering, and someone is tying a knot into a length of red thread. Not for rebellion, not for ritual, but because her mother taught her to. And some things, even czars, can't unteach that. The wind shifts as you walk, and suddenly the path feels less like a stroll and more like a tightrope. The trees are thinner now, but the tension is thicker. You've stepped into an age of paranoia, and it doesn't wear a crown or a cassock. It wears fur-lined robes and a ring heavy with imperial seal. This is the time of blame, and witches were the easiest people to blame for everything. You're not just walking into a village anymore. You're walking into a courtroom with no defense attorney, a battlefield with invisible enemies, and a gossip network faster than any royal courier. Welcome to the era when witches became spies, seductresses, and scapegoats, sometimes all at once. Let's set the scene. A crop fails, a child dies, a general loses a battle. The people look upward, the priests look inward, and the boyars look sideways. For someone to name, someone to point to, someone who couldn't push back, and who better than a woman who kept to herself, who owned a suspicious number of cats and once glared too long at the mayor's horse. Mainstream historical fact: between the 17th and 18th centuries, accusations of witchcraft in Russia were increasingly tied to political consequences. It wasn't just about curses and charms anymore. Witches were blamed for failed diplomatic missions, military defeats, even bad harvests during state holidays. One particularly dramatic case in 1690 involved a noblewoman accused of sending a love demon to bewitch a visiting foreign ambassador, which is either terrifying or wildly flattering. Fringe tidbit: there's a record from 1722 of a woman named Matriona, a washerwoman in a provincial garrison town, who was accused of spying on military meetings by transforming into a magpie. The charge was not dismissed out of hand. Her defense? "I am too round to be a bird." Iconic. Historians still argue whether the state actually believed these things or simply used them to manage public unrest. Was it genuine superstition in the courtrooms, or political theater dressed in superstitions clothes? Some believe the answer is both. When fear is useful, truth becomes optional. You reach the edge of a manor house now. Faded banners still flap in the wind. This was once a place of wealth. Now it's quieter. The family lost a son in a hunting accident, so they say. But the servants whisper that it wasn't the hunting. It was the necklace he found buried in the roots of an oak tree, wrapped in horsehair and threaded with teeth. A gift, he said, from a girl who smiled without blinking. He wore it for 3 days. On the 4th, he was dead. You peer through a crack in the manor gate. There's an old woman sweeping the steps, slowly, methodically. You can't hear what she's humming, but it's not a church hymn. You recognize the pattern. It's the rhythm of something older, half lullaby, half warning. In this time, witches weren't just healers or midwives. They became tools of accusation. Convenient explanations. Why did my husband stop loving me? A spell. Why did I lose the favor of the Tsar? Enchantment. Why did I gamble away the family estate? Clearly a hex. Never your fault, always hers. But here's the twist. Some witches leaned into it. If you were already feared, why not become useful? Some women began selling curses, for real. Quietly, not always for money, sometimes for favors, for protection, for silence. "You want his love?" she'd say. "Leave me a tooth and 3 drops of your blood." And if it worked, whether by spell or coincidence, everyone noticed. The church tried to stamp this out, but they couldn't keep up. For every trial they held, 10 more rumors bloomed, and some rumors got creative. Witches seducing guards, witches dancing with Polish saboteurs, witches whispering spells into soup bowls to make generals forget their war plans. One woman, Agasha of Vitebsk, was accused in 1711 of causing 3 horses to go lame, 6 chickens to lay no eggs, and 1 nobleman to develop an unfortunate stutter before a marriage proposal. She was also accused of keeping bees that understood Polish. The records don't clarify what that means, but it sounds impressive. And always, beneath the surface of the accusation, was this quiet theme: jealousy. Women who were too clever, too calm, too untouched by shame. It wasn't just what they did, it was what they didn't need: a husband, a priest, approval. Another case. In a small court near Smolensk, a soldier's wife was accused of witchcraft because she had no children, didn't attend church regularly, and laughed when others prayed. When asked to explain herself, she said, "I laugh when things are funny." She didn't walk free. She walked out into exile, branded not with iron, but with silence. No one in her village ever spoke her name again, not aloud. You step through a tangle of frostbitten reeds now. Ahead, a burned-out cottage, no roof, just a shell. This was the fate of many witches, not execution, but erasure. Their homes destroyed, their names omitted, their stories retold until the women in them became monsters, or jokes, or lessons. But some things can't be erased: the herbs that still grow in abandoned gardens, the stories whispered during thunderstorms, the habit of never ever whistling inside because it might call something in. Witches became scapegoats because they were perfectly placed between trust and suspicion, familiar but strange, helpful but independent, present but ungovernable. You could ask them for help on Monday and report them on Thursday, and both actions would make perfect sense, because both let you sleep better at night. And still they persisted. Even now you might meet a woman in a market who sells herbs with no labels, who ties your purchase in cloth, not paper, who looks at your face just a second too long before saying, "For your mother's pain, take it before dusk," with warm milk, and don't speak her name for a day. You'll nod, you'll pay, you won't ask questions. Because even in this age of czars and trials, of armies and accusations, the witch remained what she had always been. The answer no one wanted to believe worked, until it did. A fog has crept in with the morning, low and slow, like someone doesn't want to wake the land too quickly. You pass beneath it as you walk, and now the world is muffled, softer, the kind of quiet that feels sacred or suspicious. Either way, you've entered monastery territory. Tall stone walls rise up ahead, punctuated by narrow windows and a bell tower. Inside, monks move like shadows, heads down, eyes half lowered. You're not unwelcome here, but you're not exactly wanted either. This is a place of order, chanting schedules, scriptural rules, and no room for the chaos of dreams or the whispers of old women stirring smoke into honey. This is where the real war was fought, not with swords or sermons, but with silence, between the orthodox monasteries and the so-called old beliefs, and right in the middle of that tension stood the village witches, whether they meant to or not. You follow a dirt path around the outer wall. There's a vegetable garden here, orderly, tame, blessed with holy water each spring. But beyond it, just beyond the monastery's land, is a second patch. Wild herbs, twisting vines, nothing neat, no clear rows, and someone's been tending it, carefully. That's your first clue. Mainstream historical fact: by the 17th century, Russian monasteries had become powerful centers not only of faith, but of influence. They held land, they held documents, and they held the authority to determine what counted as heresy. In many regions, monastic priests were charged with identifying and rooting out the remnants of folk belief, especially when those beliefs were held in the hands of women with too much local power. Fringe tidbit: in more than one monastery archive, there are references to whisper women, not officially recorded as witches, but known to live near the edges of monastic territory. Some were tolerated, a few were even visited, in secret, by monks who suffered from ailments they couldn't confess to their brethren. There's a marginal note from 1682 in one such ledger: "The salve worked. Glory to God, burn the rest." Historians still argue whether this era's fight against witches was a matter of genuine spiritual concern, or a strategic maneuver to absorb cultural control from rural women. Some claim the church was trying to save souls, others say they were trying to silence competition. You pause near a wooden bench half rotted with moss. On it sits a bowl, empty, but the rim is dusted with ash, burned herbs, juniper maybe, or mugwort, which means someone used it recently, for cleansing, for remembering, for something. You glance back at the monastery. No one's looking at you, but someone knows you're here. In the fields beyond, there's a small hut, probably used for storage, or maybe for penance, or maybe for those conversations no one wants to admit ever happened. You step inside. On the floor, under a loose board, you find it, a bundle. Old cloth, a little pouch of dried poppy heads, a paper icon that's been folded too many times. Not destroyed, just hidden. Here's the truth. The church tried to burn out folk magic, but it didn't eradicate it. It just absorbed it, or at least tried. Some monks began writing manuals, quiet, secret ones, on how to spot signs of witchcraft, not just flying or cursing or summoning beasts, but subtler things, herbs in odd places, patterns of behavior, a woman who didn't weep when her husband died, a child who slept through thunderstorms. You know, the usual signs of evil. One such manual, rumored to be kept in the cellars of the Kirillo-Belozersky monastery, listed 23 signs of dark favor, including milk that does not spoil, bread that stays warm too long, and a cat that answers when spoken to in jest. Truly, the devil's work. But while the monks wrote and chanted and circled suspicious names in their ledgers, the witches, or the wise women, or the not-so-careful midwives, kept working, quietly, without titles, without temples, just hands and memory and repetition. You step back out into the light, such as it is. The sun is trying its best. So are the bells, ringing for midday prayer now. A soft, metallic call, but just behind it, almost inaudible, is something else. A hum, a woman's voice, singing, from the woods just past the monastery's fence. You follow the sound. It leads you to a clearing, not marked on any official map. In the center, a stone, flat and warm, worn smooth by time and use. People have knelt here, maybe monks, maybe witches, maybe both. And that's the strange thing. In this time, in this war, the line between enemy and seeker was never clean. Records show cases where monks accused women of witchcraft, and then went to them later in secret for protection against nightmares, for salves, for love potions, for mercy. Another story, in 1703, a monk named Tikhon in the Tver region was disciplined for speaking charms before breakfast. When pressed, he admitted he had learned them from a local widow who treated his recurring cough. He insisted they were merely poems. He was reassigned. The widow was not heard from again. The church feared these women not just because they practiced old rites, but because they didn't need permission. A monk needed a blessing to begin. A witch needed only time and a handful of ash. One required a bishop's seal. The other, a warm stone and a feather from a bird that landed at the right time. You sit now at the edge of that same clearing, and you realize this was never a war of fire and brimstone. It was a slow erosion, a quiet campaign, not to destroy the witches, but to make people forget they ever existed in the first place, to fold their songs into silence, their herbs into weeds, their wisdom into nonsense. But here you are, and here they are, still. You walk along a frozen stream now, tracing its winding path as it snakes past groves of birch and crumbling stone fences. The world is still, but not empty. You feel it, not a presence exactly, more like attention, as though the land is listening to you, not with ears, but with memory. And tonight, that memory leads you into the coldest chapter yet. Trial by ordeal, the ways the church and the state tested for witches in Russia. And spoiler alert, none of them involved flying broomsticks or talking frogs. No, Russian witch trials favored a different kind of spectacle. Quiet, intimate, harsh, less about fire, more about humiliation. And if you thought Europe had the market cornered on cruel tests, think again. You arrive at a village square. It's empty now, but you can picture it. Villagers gathered, arms crossed against the cold, eyes shifting between the priest and the accused. She's standing barefoot on frost-covered earth, her blouse soaked through from snowmelt, her hair tied back, not out of pride, but so no one mistakes defiance for disorder. There are 3 birch branches laid neatly on a stump, and a bucket of water. One of them's been blessed, one of them's been boiled, one of them's waiting. Mainstream historical fact: while Russia didn't lean on mass public burnings like in Western Europe, it had its own chilling toolkit. Accused witches might be subjected to ordeals involving freezing rivers, boiling water, or birch switches. One popular method was the ordeal by water. If you sank, you were innocent, but drowned. If you floated, you were a witch, and could be punished accordingly. You can't win, you can only survive. Fringe tidbit: in certain regions, particularly around Vologda and Arkhangelsk, there were whispered tales of the trial of the mirror, a lesser-known method where the accused was made to stare into a covered mirror for a full hour, blindfolded, then recount everything she saw, while her pulse was measured. A steady heartbeat meant truth, a racing one meant lies. There's no record of anyone passing. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were meant to produce truth or merely obedience. Some suggest the church saw them as a last resort, a way to settle disputes when confession couldn't be coerced. Others argue they were designed to break the body just enough to force compliance without martyrdom. You walk past the village bathhouse, the banya, still warm from recent use. You peek inside. Birch switches line the walls, some fresh, some blackened at the ends. The bathhouse was both sacred and feared. It was where children were born, where spirits were said to hide in the steam, where witches were tested, cleansed, or sometimes exorcised, not with holy water, but with boiling water and sharp words. Imagine it. A woman accused of witchcraft is brought into the banya by 2 others. She's stripped, scrubbed, her skin reddened by heat and birch. She's told it's a cleansing, but the way the others glance at each other says otherwise. If she winces too much, she's guilty. If she doesn't flinch at all, well, that's worse. Clearly protected by something unnatural. And then there were the birch trials, not recorded in most church documents, but passed down in whispers. A branch is cut fresh from the tree, blessed by the priest, and laid across the back of the accused. If she bruises, she's innocent. If her skin stays clean, she's guilty, marked by the devil's hand. And if she cries, well, what is she hiding? You pass a frozen pond. In the center is a hole, cut clean and square. Ice fishing, maybe, or not. Some trials involved immersion, tying the accused and lowering her into the frigid water to see how the body responded. Resistance meant guilt. Cold silence meant innocence, or death. There's a story from 1731. A woman named Katerina was accused of making a merchant's son go mad. She was calm, the court wrote, too calm. So they tried the snow trial, walking her barefoot around the edge of the village at dusk. If the snow melted where she stepped, she was guilty. If it didn't, she was dead by morning. Either way, the priest claimed God had judged. And yet, here's what makes it all feel stranger. These weren't always public trials. Many happened in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, attended only by a priest, a notary, and a fearful neighbor. Why so secret? Because they weren't about warning others. They were about removing someone quietly, efficiently, without making too much noise. Not a cautionary tale, a whisper erased. Another case. In a village near Suzdal, an accused witch was given the silent bell, a method where the local bell ringer would toll the church bell once every hour for 3 nights, but no one was allowed to speak her name. If she confessed before the bell stopped, her soul could be saved. If not, she would be buried in unmarked ground, her body facing away from the church. She never confessed, but wildflowers grew where she was laid, every spring, bright red. You stop at the edge of an abandoned shed. Something scratches inside, not animal, not person, just the sound of wind rattling through a forgotten charm. A wooden triangle hanging from a nail, bound with twine and feathers. Probably nothing. Probably. The thing is, the church claimed to hate superstition, but it used it. Ordeal wasn't about the devil. It was about doubt, and doubt is powerful. If you're unsure about someone, even just a little, they've already lost. And the more these trials broke people, the more they proved the system worked, not because it was fair, but because it was final. And when a woman did survive her trial, when she didn't float, when her bruises did bloom, when her feet bled properly into the snow, the church didn't apologize. They just watched, closely, because even if she passed, the fact that she had been accused once meant she might still be dangerous. Sometimes surviving was just another form of guilt. You walk on, past a broken fence, past the echoes of accusations no one remembers the details of anymore. But the rituals, the ordeals, those remain, in stories, in proverbs, in the way someone glances sideways at a neighbor who walks too quietly. And maybe in you, if you find yourself hesitating before tying a scarf the wrong way, or picking up a branch that doesn't belong there. Because the old ordeals might be over, but the fear that invented them never really left. The fog lifts as you continue walking, not because the air clears, but because the past you've stepped into no longer bothers to hide. Ahead lies something strange, and you feel it before you see it. A mirror, tall and crooked, nailed to a tree with iron nails. Its surface is cracked, not broken, but spiderwebbed, like it caught something that tried to get out. You shouldn't be able to see your reflection in a mirror like that. But you do. And in the world of Russian witches, mirrors didn't just show your face. They showed your secrets. And tonight, we step into a story that starts not with a curse or a trial, but with a woman who looked into her mirror and saw the end of her empire. This is the tale of the Tsarina who feared her own reflection. Her name was Anna Ivanovna, niece of Peter the Great, Empress of Russia. Crowned in 1730, she ruled with cold elegance, a steel heart, and, according to rumor, a mirror that was always covered. It hung in her private chambers, draped in black cloth, and only uncovered during new moons, when she was said to stand alone in the dark and whisper into it. She believed, or feared, that it was enchanted, that it showed her things, not demons, not angels, something worse, possibilities. Mainstream historical fact, Anna Ivanovna was deeply superstitious. She relied on a circle of advisors who frequently dabbled in astrology, numerology, and unofficial spiritual rituals. One of her most trusted chambermaids was later accused of whispering spells through glass, and court documents refer to a series of unfortunate deaths that followed the Empress's private seances. Fringe tidbit? According to a 19th century memoir, questionable but delicious, Anna once ordered an entire room painted in black and gold to match the colors of prophecy. The room had only one piece of furniture, a chair facing a mirror. No one was allowed to enter it without her permission, and the guards claimed the mirror sometimes reflected people who weren't in the room. Again, probably nonsense. But then again, history often leaves out the really interesting parts. Historians still argue whether Anna's obsession with mirrors came from personal madness or a cultural fear of reflective surfaces. In Russian folk magic, mirrors were believed to be thin places, doorways where spirits could pass through, where a curse could be sent or received, where a name spoken could bounce back, with consequences. And that fear wasn't limited to the palace. In village homes, mirrors were often covered during storms, funerals, or whenever a woman was in labor. Why? Because mirrors remembered. If death or birth passed nearby, the mirror might try to keep part of it. Children weren't allowed to see their reflection until after their first tooth. Some midwives wouldn't enter a home if they saw an uncovered mirror near the bed. And as for witches, they were said to use mirrors like letters, whispering secrets, tying knots in their reflections, sealing messages in breath fog and wiping it away with thumbprints. The shape of the mirror mattered, round ones for love, oval for dreams, square for justice, broken ones. Well, those were buried or fed to fire. You step closer to the mirror on the tree. It doesn't reflect you clearly. It seems to lean just slightly, as if listening. A small etching is scratched into the wood beside it. Не зову, если не готов услышать. Do not call unless you are ready to hear. You back away. Another story, from the Volga region. A girl named Lydia found a shard of mirror in the woods and kept it hidden under her pillow. She claimed it showed her a future where her mother never died. She became obsessed, stopped speaking, wouldn't eat unless the mirror told her to. One day, the shard disappeared. They found it buried under the floorboards with a single word scratched on it. Vzato. Taken. She recovered, slowly, but never went near her reflection again. The church, of course, hated mirrors, not outright. Too many noble homes had them, but in peasant houses they were frowned upon. Monks warned that mirrors were doors for the idle mind, and some churches removed them from confessional booths entirely. One monastery banned reflective glass entirely after a novice claimed he saw a monk's face appear backward. But the witches knew how to use them, not for vanity, for navigation. One charm involved setting 2 mirrors facing each other, then placing a candle in between. The flame was said to burn differently depending on what you asked. Fast if your lover was unfaithful, tall if danger was near, no flame at all, don't ask again. You pass a well now and something sparkles at the bottom, not water, glass, a broken mirror, tossed in and forgotten, or sacrificed, a cleansing, or a curse. In the world of Russian witches, you never throw away a mirror without telling it why. And this returns us to the Tsarina. Anna kept her mirror covered until her death. No one knows what she saw in it. Some say it showed her the faces of the nobles who would betray her. Some say it reflected only her, but older, sicker, already buried. The cloth was never removed, even as she died, and when the servants finally uncovered it, the glass was shattered from the inside. No official records mention this, but the court painter destroyed all portraits of Anna made after 1738. Only earlier ones survive. Coincidence? Sure. Probably. Maybe. You reach a small cottage now, tucked into the edge of a copse. In the window hangs a mirror, not inside, facing out. It's cracked at the corner. The owner isn't trying to see herself. She's watching for something. You knock once. No answer, just a voice, soft, behind the door. Don't look at it tonight, it's listening. You step away. Witches were feared for many reasons, but one of the most powerful was this. They saw what others couldn't, and they knew that sometimes what you see sees you back. So tonight, when you pass your mirror, maybe just for fun, cover it with a cloth, not because you're afraid, just in case it isn't finished watching. The road changes again, the stones beneath your boots becoming softer, looser, packed by hooves, not footsteps. You're no longer just walking through memory or myth. You're entering the places where soldiers marched and where witches followed them. Not with swords, but with whispers, smoke, and thread. This is the chapter the generals didn't like to talk about. The one where witches weren't merely punished, they were feared on the battlefield. Tonight, we're stepping into a part of Russian folklore where witches went to war. Now, no one officially summoned them. There were no battalions of spellcasters enlisted in the Tsar's army. But unofficially, quietly, witches were present, and not just in spirit. They stitched charms into coats. They read the bones before a campaign. And sometimes they were accused of cursing entire regiments. You pass an old mile marker. The stone is cracked, but a boot print is carved into the base. Someone once stood here and vowed something into the wind. You can almost hear it. Not a soldier, a woman, and not a blessing. Mainstream historical fact: Russian military campaigns in the 16th through 19th centuries were often haunted by reports of unexplained illness, bad weather, and strategic missteps, especially when soldiers passed through regions associated with strong folk traditions. In several documented cases, generals wrote of unnatural resistance in occupied villages, often blaming charmed wells, enchanted food, or women who smiled too knowingly. Fringe tidbit: during the Napoleonic invasion of 1812, a French officer recorded in his journal that his horses refused to move after drinking from a stream in Smolensk. Locals later claimed the stream had been spoken to by an old woman the week prior. The officer reported hearing whistling at night. He described it as not human, not entirely wind. Historians still argue whether these battlefield stories were fear-induced hallucinations or strategic deflections. After all, blaming a loss on a witch was often safer than admitting your own mistake. But then again, a lot of unusual things happened on those fields. You pass a grove of ash trees now, scorched black from a long-forgotten fire. Beneath one, there's a circle of stones. Inside, buttons, rusted nails, a comb, and a feather wrapped in red thread. Not trash, a binding spell. Planted where soldiers once slept, a charm to dull their senses, or to make them forget what they'd seen. One tale from the Russo-Turkish Wars tells of a woman named Fyodora who followed the army at a distance, her satchel full of bone dice and nettle oil. Soldiers claimed she appeared only after battles, collecting soil, humming into her palm, speaking to the crows. When questioned, she said she was helping the ground remember. No one knew what that meant. She disappeared during a snowstorm. The next day, half the regiment's boots were found tied together by knots made from their own laces. That's the story anyway. And then there were the protective charms. Witches weren't always enemies. Many soldiers sought them out before campaigns, quietly, off the record. A sprig of dried rowan sewn into a cuff, a coin spit polished and tied with black thread around the ankle. A promise never to take it off, not until the war ends, or the man does. A letter survives from 1759, written by a young infantryman to his mother. In it, he thanks her for the thread with the knots. He says he tied it around his musket and survived a blast that killed the men on either side of him. He tells her not to tell the priest, but to send more. Of course, the church condemned this. A soldier trusting in a witch's charm instead of divine providence? Blasphemy. But when you're shivering in the mud 30 miles from home and the trees are full of eyes, you pray to whoever listens fastest. You step into a ruined chapel now. The ceiling's gone, but the altar's still there. And behind it, a strange bundle, bits of wool, a nail, a twist of animal hair, wrapped around a torn military sash, left as an offering or a warning. There's another story passed around among old veterans long after Napoleon limped back west. A woman with a lopsided braid who stood on a hill near Smolensk. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just watched. Every cannon aimed near her misfired. Every soldier who tried to approach her tripped, fell, or forgot what they were doing. After the war, the locals claimed she had been their witch of last resort, one they hadn't spoken to in decades, one they'd begged for help, one who only came when the forest bled. She wasn't thanked, just feared, as usual. Another odd detail? In several accounts, soldiers who survived battles near deeply superstitious villages reported hearing things the night before conflict. Strange laughter, the sound of bones clicking, voices that seemed to come from beneath the earth. Some wrote it off as nerves, others never wrote again. And perhaps strangest of all, stories of reverse sabotage. Witches said to have protected entire units by binding enemy weapons, blinding enemy scouts, or making the road feel longer than it really was. Not for gold, not for glory, but because they had a son in that regiment, or because they liked one officer's handwriting, or because they simply felt like it. Because that's the thing, witches weren't nationalists, they weren't soldiers, they didn't serve states, they served balance, sometimes mercy, sometimes revenge. And if a general happened to benefit, good for him. But that was never the point. You exit the chapel and pause on the hill. The wind picks up, something flutters in the grass, an old coin wrapped in cloth, pierced by a pin. You don't touch it. You know better. It's not for you. So many wars were fought in Russia, but some weren't between armies. They were between certainty and fear, order and chaos, prayer and knowing. And sometimes the witches won, not with fire, but with feathers, knots, and patience. So next time you read about a war that was lost to mud, or miscommunication, or strange behavior in the ranks, just ask yourself, was it the weather? Or did someone bury a bone and whisper? The air turns still again, as if it's holding something in its lungs. You've crossed fields, forests, battlefields, and kitchens. But now you enter somewhere stranger. Not a village, not a battlefield, a ledger. A thick one, bound in leather, stitched by careful fingers, and locked with a clasp that no one wants to admit exists. This is the church's own secret, the manual it kept quiet, the one that didn't make it to Sunday sermons or gilded icons, the one whispered between abbots and inquisitors behind closed monastery doors. Tonight, you found the church's quiet witch manual. Now, don't expect a single book. There were many, scattered, partial, often handwritten, but they shared something, an intent to detect, decode, and quietly destroy the influence of witches in the Orthodox world, not with bonfires, with observation, with ritual, and, if necessary, with silence. You step into a room lined with shelves, dust thick enough to hold footprints. One book lies open, pages warped from age, not printed, scrawled, Cyrillic letters looped with urgency. At the top, O Priznika Koldovstva, on the signs of witchcraft. Mainstream historical fact. While the Russian Orthodox Church never produced a standardized Malleus Maleficarum, like Western Europe's Catholic inquisitors did, it did create its own internal guidelines for identifying spiritual threats, and witches were quietly included. Archival evidence from the 17th and 18th centuries reveals informal treatises written by monastic scribes on signs of unnatural influence, often distributed among clergy during training. Fringe tidbit, one particularly strange page found in the basement of the Solovetsky Monastery, listed 33 suspicious behaviors, including weeping without tears, spitting toward the west, boiling cabbage alone, and owning a chicken that answers to no name. The list is real, the logic less so. Historians still argue whether these manuals were widely used or quietly ignored. Some claim they were an act of desperation, an attempt to make sense of rural practices the church couldn't control. Others believe they were part of a strategic effort to slowly erase folk belief from the countryside without inciting revolt. You flip the pages. There are drawings here, rough ones, diagrams of amulets, spirals with annotations. One sketch shows a layout for how to dispel the influence of the untamed woman's eye, involving 3 iron nails, a prayer said backward, and a goat that must not have seen the moon. You're not sure if this is theology or folklore or both. Another page breaks down typical traits of suspected witches, keeps a garden too successful, wears shoes with no squeak, sings songs not found in the church register, keeps a black feather above the door, also laughs during thunder. The nerve. But beneath the superstition is something colder. A section titled Corrective Interventions lists ways to respond when suspicion cannot be proven. Suggestions include exile to monasteries under observation, assignment of daily confessions, withholding of sacraments, and community disassociation. You walk through this imagined archive and realize this wasn't always about stopping a spell. Sometimes it was about making a woman disappear without leaving blood on the floor. There's a story from Novgorod. A woman named Dunya was known for her teas. They cured headaches, helped sleep. One day, a local priest fell ill and accused her of bewitching his stomach. She was called before the church. She was never tried, never jailed, just assigned to spiritual correction at a distant monastery. She spent the next 20 years copying psalms and tending goats. Her name never appeared again in parish records. But the teas, those recipes survived. You reach another shelf. This one has prayer scrolls, but tucked between 2 is a small envelope. Unmarked, inside is a single charm, a twist of wax and string shaped like a tiny man. Crude, burnt on one side. Is it evidence, or a warning, or was it confiscated and then forgotten? Because here's the other truth. The church didn't always destroy these charms. Sometimes they were kept, stored, cataloged. Why? For study, protection, or some kind of spiritual arms race. After all, how do you defend against a spell if you've never seen one up close? And then there's the language in these manuals. Subtle, quiet, almost embarrassed. They rarely say witch. They say she of shadow, the crooked tongue, the knotted cloth. It's as if writing the word would give it power, or admit they feared what they claimed to condemn. Another page describes protective architecture. Thresholds made of ash, windows glazed in vinegar water, icons facing opposite directions to confuse spirits. This isn't church doctrine. This is village magic disguised as clerical wisdom. And yet, there it is, in the margins, surviving. You close the book, Dust blooms around your fingers. The silence grows. This room has heard things, not screams, whispers. Like all institutions, the church wanted control, but it knew there were things in the woods, in the kitchens, in the women who didn't bow quite right that it could not fully grasp. So it documented, filed, labeled, and then, slowly, pretended none of it had ever mattered. But the documents remain. You exit the imaginary archive, the shadows of books still clinging to your coat. Ahead, the world continues. Fields, bells, smoke rising from homes where women still stir herbs with the same spoons their grandmothers used. The church may have feared the devil, but what it feared more was knowing without permission. And these women, these witches, never asked for it. They just did. The road narrows again, but not in distance, in time. What you're stepping into now isn't a battlefield or a village square. It's a hearth, a home, a place where the rules of church and state fade behind curtains and kitchen steam. You're about to meet something rare in this world of accusations and exile, a witch's daughter who marries a priest. You stop outside a cottage, not fancy, not poor, the in-between kind, roof patched with care, a garden that's half herbs, half flowers. Inside, someone is singing, a low rhythmic hum. It's not a hymn, but it's not unholy either. It's something in between, like the woman herself. Her name was Vera. Her mother was called Zlata. Her grandmother never had a name anyone used out loud. You get the picture. Zlata was the village midwife, the one they called when the priest was too far or too slow. The one with a dried frog on her shelf, a fox pelt nailed above the door, and an uncanny habit of showing up before she was needed. People respected her, feared her a little. She was never accused of witchcraft, not officially, but her name appeared on the church's watch list twice. Mainstream historical fact: in many Russian villages, women from known witching families, those associated with folk medicine, midwifery, or unusual knowledge, were quietly monitored by the church. They weren't always persecuted, but they were never left alone. And their children, often forced to walk a tightrope between suspicion and redemption. Vera was the tightrope. She was bright, literate, fluent in scripture and in charm songs. Her mother taught her how to cleanse a sick room with juniper and salt. Her father, whoever he was, never stayed long. But her tutor came from the church. He saw promise. She could recite psalms. She could also reverse a nosebleed with a bit of wool and a whispered rhyme. The church pretended not to notice. And then she met Ivan, young, earnest, a seminarian with a clean heart and a soft voice. He visited to deliver a Bible, stayed for tea, came back for advice. Eventually admitted he couldn't stop dreaming about her. Always in white, always standing between two rivers. One ran forward, the other backward. She told him that was a warning. He married her anyway. Here's your fringe tidbit. In several surviving folk songs from northern Russia, there are verses about the priest's wife who knows too much, often sung in half jest, half fear. One line says, she crosses left, she blesses right, she stirs the soup with second sight. No record of who they were written about, but stories like Vera's were more common than we admit. Historians still argue whether such unions were acts of rebellion, redemption, or rural necessity. Some believe priests married into witching families to gain access to local trust. Others argue it was love, complicated, dangerous love, or maybe just curiosity that hardened into commitment. You step inside the imagined home now. The air smells of wax, rye bread, and mugwort. A child's doll sits near the fire, wrapped in red thread. An icon hangs on the wall, flanked by dried nettle and garlic braids. A Bible sits on the shelf. So does a bone-handled knife, nestled beside it. Vera didn't renounce her roots. She didn't burn her mother's charm bundles. She kept them, modified them, hid them in plain sight. She blessed her children twice, once with holy water, once with smoke. She taught them to cross themselves and to never sweep dirt out of the house after sunset, just in case. Her husband? He looked the other way, and occasionally, the other direction. When a villager came to Vera with a fever, or a dream, or a birth that wasn't going smoothly, he told himself it was just herbal knowledge, just tradition, until he got sick one spring and she fed him something green and glowing that no one else could name. He recovered. He never asked again. There's a story about the baptism of their second child. The priest, not Ivan, a visiting elder, saw something in Vera's eyes and insisted she step back from the font. She did, but after the ceremony, the baby cried until Vera touched him. Then he fell silent, slept for 12 hours. The elder never returned. Another tale from later in her life. A fire broke out in the village. 3 homes lost, a 4th spared, the one with a dried crow foot nailed to the beam. Vera's. Some said it was luck. Others said it was more. She never confirmed either way. You find a bundle beneath her bed, salt, nettle, a lock of hair. Not labeled, but clearly meaningful. These weren't spells, they were protections. Memory wrapped in muscle. Belief passed through hands, not text. And that's the strange thing. Vera wasn't hiding, but she wasn't fighting either. She was balancing, living proof that witch and priest could live under the same roof, that you could say a blessing with one hand and untie a nightmare with the other. Not everyone was thrilled. Some whispered that her children would grow up marked, that the church would never fully accept them. Others said her eldest son had the second sight, could tell when a cow would birth twins just by listening to the wind. Still others said nothing at all, or just looked sideways when she walked into the market. But she endured, because endurance is a witch's truest spell. One final note. When Vera died, quietly, in her sleep, on the coldest night of the year, her husband washed her body himself. No priest was called. He sang psalms. He also buried her with a feather under her tongue and a silver needle threaded into her braid. Not out of fear. Out of love. Because even holy men know, when you marry a woman who walks with both light and shadow, you don't pretend she's something she's not. You honor her, fully. And you never ever forget her. The wind has teeth again, not cruel, just sharp enough to make you remember you're still alive. You wrap your coat tighter and follow the sound of creaking gates toward a small hill that overlooks a village cemetery. But this isn't about tombstones or epitaphs. It's about what lives under them and what witches left behind. You've reached the part of the story where superstition slips into full-blown ritual, graveyard dirt and crows at noon, because in old Russia, the dead weren't always allowed to rest, not when witches needed them for protection, or revenge, or insurance. You stand at the edge of the graveyard. It's not big. A few crooked wooden crosses, one stone slab with a faded name. But there's movement here, a flutter, a crow. Not unusual, unless it's exactly noon. Then you're supposed to pay attention. Mainstream historical fact. Russian folk tradition treated graveyards with immense, often fearful respect. They weren't just places to mourn. They were places of power, where thresholds between the worlds of the living and dead thinned. Witches, cunning women, and healers were said to gather graveyard dirt to use in rituals. For hexes, for healing, for binding, often from unmarked or untended graves. The more forgotten the soul, the more pliable its energy. Fringe tidbit. In the Komi region, there was a belief that crows that circled above a cemetery at midday weren't birds at all, but the souls of the misburied. If a witch spoke to one and offered it bread soaked in blood, it might reveal secrets, or agree to follow a person for life as a watcher. Historians still argue whether these graveyard rites were fringe beliefs or a widely accepted part of rural folk practice. Some claim they were the product of Christian and pagan overlap. The idea that the soul's resting place had both spiritual danger and magical utility. Others argue that these rituals were largely invented later, romanticized by collectors of folklore. Still, the charms themselves exist. Many were hidden in walls, some were buried under floors, and some were left behind. You step past a rotted fence post and into the grass. It crunches underfoot, still touched by frost. Beneath your boot, something unnatural, a piece of cloth. Black, bundled, you crouch, careful. It's a small pouch, tied shut with twine, stained dark. You don't open it. You already know, grave dirt, probably mixed with salt, and maybe a fingernail or a hair. This was a binding charm, left here, planted like a seed. Why? Well, maybe someone wanted to ensure a child stayed obedient. Maybe they wanted a neighbor's gossip to turn sour in her mouth. Maybe they just needed protection. And the dead, especially the unblessed dead, were known to keep promises. You turned toward the woods just beyond the cemetery. In many villages, witches were never buried in consecrated ground. If they were too useful to burn, too clever to exile, they were simply denied the ritual. Their graves were dug in the forest, shallow, secret, but people still found them and left offerings, not flowers, bones, knots, charms. There's a tale from Yekaterinburg. An old witch named Avdotia was said to live to 102. When she died, no priest would bury her. The villagers interred her in the woods with a broken mirror and a spoon that had never touched salt. A year later, during the spring melt, a child wandered near the grave and returned claiming he'd seen Avdotia knitting beneath the soil. His fever broke the next day. No one doubted the story. You approach a stone with symbols carved into it, not Cyrillic, not any known alphabet, just marks, loops and X's and a spiral that coils inward and stays there. These weren't made recently, but they've been tended. Someone cleaned this stone. Someone left the crow feather tucked behind it. And speaking of crows, there it is, perched on the fence. One eye white, the other black. It caws once, not twice, just once. In folk belief, that's a sign of an unfinished promise, or someone watching. Or both. You glance up at the sun. It's high, just past noon, a bad time to linger in places like this. In witchcraft traditions across the Slavic north, midday was more dangerous than midnight. Midnight was theatrical, midday was thin. Shadows stretched wrong, the living world hiccuped. If you had to bury something magical or dig something up, noon was when you did it, because that's when spirits were least tethered, but also most curious. You move toward the edge of the cemetery. Someone's left a bundle in the crook of a tree. Bread, garlic, a single silver earring, and a folded note. Written in red. You don't open it. That's between her and whatever she was bargaining with. And here's something strange. Some priests knew about these practices, didn't condone them, but didn't always stop them. There's a record from a small church in Tula of a priest who found graveyard dirt in the font. He didn't report it. He just drained the water, recited a prayer, and left a warning nailed to the cemetery gate. Take only what you'll carry forever. Why were witches drawn to the dead? Not for cruelty, for clarity. The dead don't lie, they don't forget, and they don't gossip. They simply know. And if you ask right, if you leave the right offering, say the right name, take the right handful of soil, they might help you, or they might just listen, and sometimes that's enough. But there were risks, always. Use the wrong grave, the spirit follows you home. Use dirt from someone who died angry, it seeps into your bones. Try to trick the dead, you don't sleep again, not properly, not until you return what you took, and something extra. One last story. In the 1800s, a young bride in Ryazan was said to have left a cursed bundle on her mother-in-law's grave. A strained relationship, to put it lightly. 2 weeks later, the bride couldn't speak. She could only caw. 3 days of silence later, they dug up the bundle and burned it. The next morning, her voice returned. She never visited the cemetery again. You reach the final row of graves. There's a small candle still smoldering. No one around. But someone was here recently. Someone needed a favor, or forgiveness, or both. You turn to leave. The crow doesn't follow. But the wind does. And when you get home tonight, if you find dirt on your doorstep, swept in despite your best efforts, don't panic. Just whisper, I remember, and sweep it out before sunset. The village you enter next doesn't look any different than the others you've passed. A few timber houses, smoke curling from chimneys, a barking dog that quiets when it sees you. But the feeling here is peculiar, like everyone's watching, without watching. No curtains move, no doors creak. It's the hush that gives it away. You've arrived in a place where a woman still lives at the edge of town, where her garden thrives in late frost, and where people leave fresh bread on her doorstep, even though they swear they don't believe in that nonsense anymore. You've arrived at the place of the White Witch. Not the villain, not the outcast, not entirely, but still, not safe. This is the dilemma the church never managed to solve. What do you do with a witch who heals? You approach her home. It's clean, neat, a woven mat at the door, a window that always stays half open, even in winter. In the garden, yarrow, calendula, marigold, and something you can't identify. A gray-green vine curling with too much purpose. There are no skulls here, no jars of snakes, just lavender tied with twine, and a cat sleeping under the bench with one eye open. She's called a healer, a helper, a znakharka, the kind you go to after 3 weeks of fever, when the hospital is too far and the priest's prayers have grown hoarse. The kind who says, drink this tea, but not during a full moon, and you nod because arguing with her just makes the illness worse. Somehow. Mainstream historical fact: in rural Russian communities well into the 19th and even 20th centuries, white witches, also called village healers, blessing women, or old mothers, were an integral part of community life. They performed rituals to banish illness, protect children, ensure good harvests. Many openly identified as Christian, but their methods were deeply rooted in pre-Christian traditions. The church tolerated them, sometimes. Fringe tidbit: in several documented cases, white witches were invited to bless churches before consecration, especially in regions where Orthodox clergy feared local resistance. They would walk the grounds, bury salt in the corners, and spit 3 times toward the forest. A quiet deal. You protect the church. We don't ask how. Historians still argue whether white witches were ever fully accepted or merely tolerated as a lesser evil. Some records suggest local priests referred to them as spiritual midwives, a euphemism that avoided calling them witches while still acknowledging their power. Others insisted even the helpful ones were dangerous, for relying on sources other than God. You step inside her cottage. It smells of cinnamon and smoke. A kettle sings softly. There are icons on the wall, but also bundles of herbs hanging beside them. A woven towel embroidered with an 8-pointed star. Not a religious symbol, but a protective one. She doesn't hide the blend, she lives in between. She offers you tea, doesn't ask what you need, she already knows. Says it's peppermint and angelica, but there's something else in it, something that tastes like honesty. And here's the thing, people say they don't believe in witches anymore, but when they get sick, really sick, they come, quietly. No one tells the priest. The woman doesn't ask for money, just an egg, a candle, maybe a story from your childhood. That's her currency, memory. Another story, in a village near Perm, a boy stopped speaking after his father died. Doctors said it was grief. A traveling priest said it was possession. The white witch said it was a shadow sitting on his tongue. She gave him an amulet of riverstone and nettleroot, told his mother to place it under his pillow and never ask about his dreams. 1 month later, the boy began to speak. His first words were, "The man under the floor is gone now." No one asked what that meant. And yet, not everyone was grateful. Some feared her more because she helped. After all, what kind of power can remove pain, find lost animals, cure what the saints couldn't? And what happens if she turns that gift backwards? Then she becomes something else. Not a healer, not a helper, but a problem. And this was the heart of the white witch dilemma. The church didn't fear her because she harmed. It feared her because she could, because she didn't ask permission, because people trusted her without sacraments. They brought her bread and news before they brought it to the parish. They asked her when to plant, when to travel, when to grieve. And that trust, it made her untouchable, until it didn't. You sip the tea, it's warming your hands, your mouth, your memory. She watches you, not unkindly, just knowingly, like she's seen your face before, even if she hasn't. She doesn't speak in riddles, she just tells you this. The birds are flying lower this year, that means the river will change. You don't ask which birds or how she knows, you just nod, because of course she knows. There's a record from 1844, a letter from a priest in Ryazan to his bishop. He writes of a local woman known as the White Widow, who healed 12 people in 1 month, faster than any prayers had. He begged permission to excommunicate her. The bishop replied only, "If she does not claim to be God, leave her be." But the problem was, she didn't claim anything. She just was. And power that doesn't need permission? That's threatening. One day, someone important gets sick or dies, and the White Witch, the helpful one, the soft-spoken one, didn't stop it. Or maybe she did, and they didn't like how. Or maybe she just knew a secret she shouldn't have. That's when the visits stop. That's when the whispers start. She's different lately. She's too quiet. She helped my son, but now my hens won't lay. The same hands that offered her candles now point behind her back. There's a tale from the Arkhangelsk region of a woman called Natalia, the snow singer. For 30 years she healed with salves and songs. People walked for days to see her. Then, one winter, a merchant's daughter fell ill and didn't recover. The family accused Natalia of withholding her magic out of spite. A hearing was held, no trial, no fire, just a quiet removal. Her house was torn down, her name scraped from the church register, but 10 years later, people still left bread on the old corner where her door used to be. That's the other truth. The White Witch never truly disappeared. She just became unnamed, and sometimes the only evidence she was ever there is the strange bundle in your attic, the salt under your pillow, the dream you had that came true, even though no one else believes you. Back in the cottage, the woman gathers your cup, doesn't ask for thanks, just hands you a small bag of dried herbs, says nothing about what they're for, just only after sunset, and only if the dog's not barking. You step outside. The wind's lighter now, the trees less tense. A single crow calls once and flies east. Witches who curse are easy to condemn. Witches who comfort are far more dangerous, because once you rely on them, it's hard to go back to not knowing they exist. So, the church feared them, not for what they did, but for what they meant. A world where help didn't come from above. It came from next door, wearing an apron, holding a spoon, saying your name like she knew what it meant before you ever spoke it. The White Witch doesn't glow, doesn't threaten, doesn't brag. She just remembers things you forgot. And when she disappears, if she ever does, the garden still blooms. The milk doesn't sour, and the path to her house never quite grows over. Because maybe she's gone. Or maybe she's just waiting for you to need her again. The village fades behind you now, and with it, the half-remembered names, the charm-braided fences, the quiet power. You're heading into a time when silence changed shape, not into whispers, but into rules, uniforms, files. This is not a world of herbs and hexes, it's a world of typewriters and denunciation. You've arrived in the age of Soviet shadows, where witchcraft didn't vanish, it simply changed its name. You walk past a rusted signpost. The letters are Cyrillic, but the paint is state-issued, thick, bureaucratic, slightly peeling. There's a faded hammer and sickle at the top, and below it, a slogan, "Science is the only truth." That's your first clue. In Soviet Russia, faith was replaced with function, but fear, that never needed permission. Mainstream historical fact. Under Stalin, religion was aggressively suppressed across the USSR. Churches were closed, icons destroyed, priests exiled or executed, and folk practices, even the harmless-seeming ones like herbal healing or protective charms, were lumped in with dangerous superstition. Practicing them could mean social ostracism, arrest, or worse. But like the best spells, old habits hid in plain sight. Fringe tidbit? In rural Soviet-era hospitals, some nurses, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, were known to quietly bless their syringes before injections. They'd claim it was habit, but if you asked them twice, they'd tap their necklace hidden under their uniform and say, "Better safe than arrested." Historians still argue whether witchcraft truly diminished under Soviet rule, or whether it simply mutated, becoming subtler, quieter, more disguised. Some argue it never left. It just slipped into different clothes, disguised as women's wisdom, disguised as regional tradition, disguised as not witchcraft. You walk past a concrete building, a former Kolkhoz headquarters, now empty. There's a strange symbol scratched into the wall near the entrance. Not graffiti, a protective sigil. You know the kind, but here's the clever part. It's shaped like a gear, so it looks like nothing. That was the game now. If you wanted to survive, you had to code your magic. Gone were the obvious things, brooms, bundles, boiling pots. Instead, a button sewn inside out, a lock of hair inside a matchbox, a mirror turned to face the wall, not because of spirits, but because you just don't like reflections. Sure. You stop at a roadside stall. An older woman sells bread, apples, cheap cigarettes. Nothing strange, except every customer leaves a coin on the left side of the table, and she never counts the change until they're gone. You ask why. She smiles. It's how my mother did it. You know how mothers are. That's how it survived. A charm in a cough remedy. A spell in the way dough is folded. A curse written in a school notebook, disguised as a poem. In the archives of the KGB, there's a case file from 1974 about a grandmother in Omsk who was arrested for dangerous superstitious practices. Her crime? She told her neighbor's son not to cut his hair during a lunar eclipse. When he later slipped and broke his arm, the neighbor reported her. Her apartment was searched. They found a jar of salt, a notebook full of dreams, and dried moss sewn into her pillow. She was released after 6 months, but she never gave up the moss. You turn down a narrow lane. There's a brick apartment block ahead, typical Khrushchevka style, uniform, bland, but one window has a red curtain, always red, no one knows why. Children whisper that the woman who lives there never sleeps, that she knew when the bread line would end early, that she buried a radio in her floorboards and it still hums when something bad's about to happen. Probably not true. Probably. Maybe. You pass a group of old women on a bench. They're peeling potatoes and talking softly. One of them points to the sky and mutters something under her breath. The others nod. You only catch one word, Vernulis. It returned. You don't ask what. You don't want to know. That was the beauty of Soviet-era witchcraft. It didn't scream. It waited. It adapted. It moved into psychology, reflexology, dream analysis, homeopathy, palm reading sold as folk wellness, curses rebranded as bad energy, blessings hidden in birthday songs, and no matter how many radio towers the state built, how many churches they raised, how many posters they printed about progress, the people still salted their thresholds and told their daughters to never whistle indoors. Because they remembered. Another tale. In the 1980s, a woman in Leningrad lost her job at a textile factory. She began selling herbal tinctures from her apartment. When the local health inspector tried to shut her down, he developed a rash on his hands that lasted 8 months. No cream worked, until the woman moved away. His rash vanished within a week. Coincidence? Of course. Definitely. Possibly. You reach the outskirts now. A statue of Lenin leans slightly under the weight of frost. Behind it, someone has tied a red thread around a birch tree. 3 loops, tight, barely visible. And in that moment, you realize the church tried to burn the witches, the state tried to erase them, but neither succeeded. Because the witch doesn't need fire. She doesn't need altars or followers. She just needs one moment of silence, one breath, one grandmother who remembers which herbs go in the tea when the fever won't break, and which go in when someone's lied to you. Witchcraft didn't die in the Soviet Union. It held its tongue. It went underground, and it watched. There's a village just beyond Smolensk that doesn't appear on most maps, not because it's hidden, but because everyone assumes it's empty, that no one lives there anymore, that it's just another collection of leaning fences and wind-blown tin roofs slowly giving in to gravity. But someone does live there. They say she's been alive longer than the Soviet Union, longer than Stalin, longer than even the war that scorched half the forests around her. No one knows her real name. People call her the babushka who wouldn't die. And yes, that's what we're doing now. You're walking into a modern folk legend, a real one, documented, whispered, half joked about at train stations and passed along between cab drivers and grandmothers like a strange prayer. You knock on her door, gently. Nothing. You wait. Then the sound. Slow steps. The door creaks open, and there she is, not monstrous, not mystical, just a woman in her 90s or hundreds, wrapped in 3 shawls, smelling faintly of old soap and cedar. She says nothing, just nods once and lets you in. Mainstream historical fact, In post-Soviet rural Russia, many remote villages were abandoned by younger generations seeking work in the cities. But some elders refused to leave. These ghost villagers became custodians of cultural memory, including deep wells of oral folklore, healing traditions, and belief systems long thought extinct. Anthropologists began encountering them in the 1990s and 2000s, recording stories that hadn't changed in hundreds of years. Fringe tidbit: several accounts, scattered and strange, describe encounters with elderly women in isolated regions who reportedly survived poisonings, falls from heights, even execution. One particularly eerie tale from Pskov tells of a woman sentenced to death during the Stalinist purges who returned home 2 weeks later, barefoot, with no memory of her trial, or so she claimed. Historians still argue whether such stories are exaggeration, mythologized memory, or signs of unacknowledged belief in blessed bodies, people who had been touched by the old magic and could not die until certain spiritual debts were paid. You sit across from the babushka, the tea is already steeping, though you never saw her boil the water. She hums as she pours. No tune you recognize, not quite lullaby, not quite hymn. She speaks at last. You've come to ask if I'm real. You don't answer, because how do you answer that? She smiles, the kind that knows too much and isn't sorry. They said I died in 1947, the cholera, but my sister was the one who had it. I wore her dress to the burial. You blink. She continues slow, like reading from a story she's already told the walls 100 times. They said I froze in 1951, got caught in the blizzard, but I built a little house under the roots, drank melted snow, sang to the wolves. They didn't eat me. One brought a rabbit. You look around. No photos, no calendar, just hand-carved icons and a worn book of psalms with its pages shuffled like a deck of cards. They sent men to shoot me in 58, she says, because I kept giving girls the tea that made them not pregnant. 3 bullets, all passed through, didn't even bruise. They called me a ghost. She chuckles. A ghost that sweeps. You ask, softly, how old she is. She shrugs. Older than the priest who called me wicked, younger than the pine outside. I don't count years, I count winters. Outside, snow starts to fall. Here's the part that sticks with you. She doesn't claim to be immortal. She just acts like death gave up trying. You notice charms above every window, not elaborate, just bits of fabric tied in knots, a silver spoon with a cracked handle nailed above the door, a broom, handmade, resting bristles up in the corner, the old rules. But it's her stories that haunt you, not because they're terrifying, but because they're casually surreal. Like when she says, I once told lightning not to strike my chimney and it listened. Or, the bears knew when I lost my sight and walked softer near the porch. You ask her, not directly, if she's a witch. She doesn't laugh, just stirs her tea and says, the word doesn't matter. I'm still here. And that's the point. She's the living memory, a walking contradiction, a woman who outlasted priests, soldiers, bureaucrats, and the 3 men who tried to burn down her house, only for the fire to die out when they stepped too close. Her story is known in pieces. Children dare each other to knock on her door. Young women visit quietly, late in the day, when no one's looking. She gives them amulets, teas, advice, but only if they bring bread. No one knows what happens if they forget the bread. One more tale. A boy from Moscow, grown tired of city life, tried to film her for a documentary, brought cameras, mics, asked questions like they were keys. None of the footage survived. When he returned to the city, every file was corrupted. The only thing that remained was a still image of her stove, cold, empty, and a single line of audio. The old ones don't like light. The babushka won't live forever, probably. But if she does, if you return in 50 years and find her still sweeping, still humming, still staring at the sky like it owes her something, you'll understand she isn't just a woman. She's what remains when no one else does. And that, more than spells or curses or secrets, is what the church feared most. Not just the witches who danced, but the ones who endured. The snow is deeper now. It pulls at your ankle, slows your steps, hushes the world. You've moved past the villages and the forests, past the watchful icons and buried charms. You've walked centuries in one night. And now, you come to a place that isn't marked by any sign or stone, a space between memory and myth where all the Russian witches go when they die. Not heaven, not hell, something older. You've reached the edge of the Iron Forest. It's not a real place, not exactly, but ask enough elders in enough distant regions, and they'll whisper of it, a place no map dares show, a forest where the trees grow in rows too perfect for nature and too twisted for man. The bark shines like steel in moonlight, the roots grow in spirals, no birds sing there. Because this is where the true witches sleep. Not the ones burned or banished, the ones remembered. The ones whose names you still hear when someone spills salt or finds a spider on a windowsill and mutters a rhyme they don't quite understand. Mainstream historical fact. Across Russia's vast landscape, the blending of Orthodox belief with centuries of animist and pagan tradition created a unique kind of cultural memory, one that preserved witches not as villains, but as border figures, guardians of forbidden wisdom. Even in Orthodox texts condemning witchcraft, there are faint undercurrents of reluctant awe, as if, deep down, the scribes knew, you don't fight what you truly fear, you record it. Fringe tidbit. In some regions of Karelia and Vologda, there's a whispered belief that certain woods absorb memory. Trees that grow on old ritual grounds are said to hum at dusk, and moss-covered stumps are treated like gravestones, not stepped on, not touched. In one village, people claim that when a witch dies, her spirit walks east until the birch trees stop growing, and there she plants her final charm. Historians still argue whether these woods were symbolic or once tied to real groves used for ritual. Some anthropologists argue that these stories function like folk arcs, ways of preserving knowledge under threat from church or state. Others believe the Iron Forest is purely poetic, a metaphor for what refuses to die. But here you are, and something about this place feels more remembered than imagined. The snow hasn't touched the trunks here. They shine silver black, bark like old armor. You touch one, and it's warm. Somewhere deep beneath the roots, you feel the heartbeat of every woman who was ever called dangerous for speaking too loudly, knowing too much, or loving too freely. You pass a clearing. There's no fire, no altar, just a circle of empty chairs. 13, different sizes. One is child-sized. One looks carved from bone. One has moss growing over the seat as if it's been waiting a long time. No one sits in them, yet. But if you lean close enough, you might hear breathing. The witches of the Iron Forest aren't here to haunt, they're here to remember. To keep the story straight. To gather the names that were scratched out, rewritten, twisted, or buried. You reach a hollow where the wind doesn't blow. In its center, a stone, flat, wide, etched with marks from 100 hands. Not words, not spells, just memory in motion. Spirals, braids, eyes, suns, crescents, broken combs, seeds, keys. You recognize them all now. You've seen them on doors and amulets woven into rugs. You thought they were decoration? They weren't. They were maps. To here. Because witches didn't leave behind cathedrals or manifestos. They left clues, knotted into lace, folded into lullabies, slipped into recipe books and whispered over soup. They built no temples, so they became their own. You kneel at the stone, not because anyone told you to, but because the ground feels right. There's a sound, faint, a woman's voice, low, no words, just tone, grief braided with joy, worry shaped into lullaby. It might be your own breath, it might not. One more tale, this one old and untraceable. They say that if a woman dies wrongly accused of witchcraft, and her name is not spoken for a generation, she walks to the Iron Forest and waits in silence. But if her story is told again, if someone says her name aloud with neither fear nor scorn, she rises from the root she sleeps beneath and speaks her final spell. No one knows what the spell does, but every time it's spoken, something cruel crumbles, somewhere. You stand now. The trees lean slightly toward you, as if listening. You leave nothing behind, no offering, no charm. Just your memory, just the shape of what you've seen. because that's the secret. Witchcraft in Russia didn't die out. It scattered. It became weather, gesture, gut instinct, a wrong turn avoided, a right word said in the wrong place that somehow makes everything stop hurting. And the Iron Forest? It's not a destination. It's a return. For every woman who knew the herbs by scent, who whispered prayers under breath but never kneeled, who stirred the pot 3 times counterclockwise just in case, who braided her daughter's hair on Easter morning and tucked a coin under her pillow the night she first bled. They didn't write history, but they held it. And here, in the hush of silver trees and snowless earth, they're still holding it. For you. For now. You don't remember exactly when you left the Iron Forest. Maybe you never did. Maybe the rest of the world just grew back around you, brick by brick, road by road, sign by sign, pretending the roots underneath had forgotten how to whisper. But you can hear it now. In the way the wind hits the corner of an old barn. In the way an elder spits 3 times before pouring tea. In the pause before someone says, "We don't talk about her." Because this story was never about witches the way you were taught. It wasn't about cackles, cauldrons, or dark bargains sealed in shadow. No broomsticks, no pointy hats, no cartoon lightning. It was about power without permission, and who gets punished for holding it. You pass a newer village now. The houses have satellite dishes and plastic windows. Teenagers scroll on cracked phones beside fences hung with drying fish. But look closer. There's a line of salt along one threshold, a string of garlic above a garage, a set of 7 stones laid out in a child's bedroom window. Not decoration. Continuance. Mainstream historical fact. In post-Soviet Russia, there has been a quiet revival of folk healing, divination, and herbal magic. Not always called witchcraft. Sometimes it's psychic work, grandmother's knowledge, or wellness rituals. The Orthodox Church still warns against it. The state still side-eyes it. But the people, they never stop needing it. Fringe tidbit. In 2016, a government official in a rural district was caught seeking advice from a local healer before making political decisions. When questioned, he said only, "The data told me one thing, but she felt something else." He was suspended. She was not. Historians still argue whether we are witnessing a return of the witch or merely the inevitable surfacing of what was never truly gone. Is this revival rebellion, or is it repair? You walk through the market. It's louder here, cheaper clothes, busier stalls, but stop at the old woman selling eggs. She won't look you in the eye, not until you put your coins down with your left hand. Then she smiles. Then she gives you an extra. You pass a mural, bright, cheerful, a girl in a scarf with sunflowers in her arms. Her eyes are too wise. Her feet hover just slightly above the dirt. You realize it's not a girl. It's a reminder. This is how the witches come back. Not through fire, but through familiarity. You hear it in lullabies that have no known author. You feel it in the way old women touch your shoulder just once when you say you're tired, and somehow you are less tired after. You see it in the way some grandmothers know when a storm's coming, even if the app says clear skies. That's not science, that's memory. The church feared the witches because they couldn't be controlled. The state feared them because they couldn't be tracked. But the truth? Witches weren't trying to rule anything. They were just trying to keep people alive. Their families, their neighbors, sometimes even their enemies. Because a true Russian witch, the kind who grows teeth in her grief and speaks softly to trees, she knows the difference between destruction and survival. She knows that the magic isn't in the flame. It's in the persistence. In every hand that learned how to bind a cut with moss. In every mother who hummed to the moon while washing her child's only coat. In every woman who buried her charms deep beneath floorboards, not to hide, but to preserve. They weren't fighting the devil. They were fighting forgetting. That's what made them dangerous. Not the spells, the stories. Because once someone tells you that healing lives in your hands, not in a book, not in a building, but in you, it becomes very hard to control you ever again. And so, we come to the end. Not of the witches, just of the walk. You've traveled through centuries in shadows. You've stood beside fires, cradled teacups, listened at keyholes. You've felt the weight of silence and the defiance of a woman who sings in it anyway. And maybe, just maybe, tonight, when the lights go out, you'll remember to turn your pillow 3 times, or not whistle after dark, or thank the kettle before pouring. Not because you believe in witches, but because they still believe in you. And sometimes that's enough. The world is quiet now. The snow has stopped, the wind has calmed, and the last of the firelight fades gently against the far wall, casting long shadows that stretch but never startle. You've made it, friend. All this way, through frost-laced villages and moonsick forest, through whispering kitchens and forgotten cemeteries, past saints and spies, healers and hunters, fear and memory. Now it's time to rest. Not just your body, your mind too, that busy buzzing part that's still trying to sort truth from tale, spell from superstition. Let it go. Let the story stay strange. Let it remain unsolved. This is what the witches knew. The real ones, the old ones, the ones who stitched secrets into lace and left no footprints in the snow. They understood that the world doesn't need to be explained to be felt. It doesn't need to be mapped to be remembered. And not every power wears a name. Some just hum. You're back now, wherever you are. Your bed, your chair, your train, your moment between waking and sleep. The walls are still. The air is soft. The world outside may be loud again come morning. But for now, you're held in something gentler. Maybe you've still got a question or two. Good. That's what keeps the old stories alive. The not knowing. The gap where truth almost lives. The space between a candle flicker and a breeze. The witches you met tonight, the feared, the forgotten, the fiery, the kind, they've done what they were meant to do, not to frighten you, not even to guide you, but to sit with you, to stay with you. So, if, in the quiet of tomorrow, you find a hair braided into your sweater thread, or a coin turned upside down on the counter, or a black bird watching you from the fence, smile. You're not cursed. You're remembered. And the memory? It's a kind one. Let your breath slow now. Let the last embers dim. You've wandered far through mystery and myth, and now it's time to close your eyes. The witches will keep watch tonight. They always have, and always will.